So this is an example of an abandoned field. So this was probably under agriculture before, and it was probably pasture. And so we've still got a lot of pasture grass in here. So this is what happens when you do what's called natural regeneration or rewilding. And basically you're leaving it alone and allowing the process of succession to happen in a natural pattern. But because we're in a urban situation, it's much more difficult getting the seed source from the natural area into this area. And so you can see things like these asters are coming in, and there's some goldenrods over here. But if you look around, you can see that most of it is pasture grasses and different clovers. So the pasture it's held on to the site, and it hasn't allowed for that natural regeneration to occur. You're getting not too many shrubs, not too many trees that are coming in here because the pasture grasses are holding on to the site. And you have things like, when you have a disturbance, you have things like this autumn olive that are coming in. It's highly invasive. Species in here are not native, they're invasive. Even this willow is a European crack willow in the background. So just knowing that this is the process that's going to happen is really important, because then you can make a decision. Okay, am I going to allow this old field to just regenerate, and then it's going to take a very long period of time before you start getting native species into a pasture or into an agricultural field that's been let go? And what can you do to facilitate its regeneration into a more climax, into a healthier ecosystem? Because all these exotic species, I'd say there's probably 60 to 80% composition of non-native species in here, and that's all habitat that's not being used by wildlife. They're not keyed to it. There's not a food source for them unless they're a cow. And we've removed the cows from this area, so allowing for that natural regeneration is okay. How do we facilitate it moving towards a healthier ecosystem? And maybe that involves trying to remove the pasture grasses beforehand, so that and then going in and doing some active restoration, seeding in native species so that you get more wildflowers in this field, because you got most of it is one species of aster, one species of goldenrod, so you're not getting a lot of diversity out here. So even just taking patches and tilling them up, seeding them with native species so that it creates like a focal point, so that it produces the seed and then the seed can spread out from there. So just adding different elements, adding some different habitat structures even to this area, adding brush piles, cutting down some of the exotic species and putting them into piles so that wildlife can use them. Different things like that. So you're creating more heterogeneity. Maybe you even come in here if you have more of a budget, and you're creating some, because a lot of farmers they want a nice homogeneous and flat landscape, and so they reduce the heterogeneity of the landscape by flattening it, and the cows flatten it as well. And so just adding more heterogeneity, maybe you're in a low spot over here, maybe you add a little bit of a dig in there, and you create a little bit of pool of water, a moisture, allowing the wildlife to have that access. So just taking different things into consideration to how are you going to increase the structure, how are you going to increase the diversity for native wildlife. So here's another urban stream. It's actually a major river that goes through the city of Toronto, and here you can see that it has a reasonable amount of health still. Around the edges is a lot of native vegetation still. It still has areas where it's narrower and areas with faster water, areas where it slows down. So you can see that there's a major road going over top of that, so underneath they've channelized it. but they've also narrowed it down and allowed for some more oxygenation, created a little bit of a riffle area back there. And then there's a bit of a pool area, so it's dropping out sediments, it's deeper area where a fish can still live. And then oxygenation again as it moves through this riffle area. And you can see as you get a little bit deeper on one side of the channel, it's going faster, flowing over the rocks and moving sediment. And then the other side is much slower and it's a little bit shallower. So that's how you get your movement of your creek back and forth. Because one side is digging down and eroding and the other side is depositing. So over time it gradually moves in one direction until it goes too far and then it starts moving back in the other direction. So it has this constant back and forth motion. And if you don't allow for having that floodplain area where it can move back and forth and reduce its speed and have areas where there's oxygenation and areas where there's dropping out, it's really important to have that to have a healthy stream. In these fast areas, you can see the rock is exposed, and so you've got your aquatic vertebrates in there, and they're holding onto that rock, they're using it as a substrate. In the deeper zones, it's dropping down sediments, and you probably have things like chronomid midges, bloodworms, and things like that, so it's a little bit less oxygen in those areas, but it's still food for the different fish that are in here, the different aquatic insects. A lot of them are filter feeders, so as the water moves by, they're collecting the nutrients and the different organisms that move by them. So you can hear that's a major road in the background, and so there's obviously going to be impacts, and a lot of the vegetation around here, I'd say probably if you do an evaluation, you're getting about 50% native species and about 50% introduced invasive species. So because we're moving into a city, you're getting much more impacts, having all these exotic species occurring along the shorelines, and much more degradation over time. So in this section of the river, you can see where they've done a little bit of engineering on the creek, and they've put a bunch of different rocks along the bottom of the creek, creating a bit of a natural riffle zone. So just adding a bit of a barrier, and it slows down the water and creates a little bit of an oxygenation zone. So you can actually put a whole strip of rocks across there, creating this cascading effect, and if you do it multiple times, you're oxygenating. And it's also creating these areas where it's digging, because when you put a bunch of rocks there, right after that, you're getting a deposition, a digging zone. And on the one side here, you can see where the side is eroding. So because we have channelization upstream, you're getting this fast rush of water, and then as soon as it starts turning a corner like that, then you get a lot of erosion happening on the one side, and you can see it's quite steep on that side. So possibly putting some sort of a log down the bottom to help redirect that back into the channel, so you're dissipating some of that energy. Planting things like fascines or cuttings, and sort of putting that at the toe of that erosion zone and helping to control that erosion, redirect the stream back in. On the other side, you can see there's a deposition zone over here, and in that area you can see that it's slower on this side, and so it's creating a bit of a mud flat on that side, and eventually that'll extend out. As it cuts more and more on the one side, it'll deposit more and more on the other side, and so it's creating that sinuosity that's not there because they've channelized the stream, so that the stream naturally wants to meander back and forth. So just creating these different opportunities for it to move, but also being aware that when you're creating these areas of mass erosion, that there are steps that you can take, putting in shrubs and trees to help minimize the impact, the power and the energy of the water, so it's not eroding quite so much. So different things like that you need to take into consideration when you're recreating this. Creating habitats with dead wood within the stream is really important, places for fish to hide underneath. So just putting logs and natural conditions in the habitat. Another other side here, you can see again the same sort of cutting on the one side and deposition on the other, so it's increasing the sinuosity. And it's nice having that slow slope there, so you're getting different zones of aquatic vegetation, whereas this side is very steep, and so you're not getting that same sort of zonation. And this area is a natural area. It's called an ANSI, or an area of natural and scientific interest. So I just wanted to show you that even in the center of Toronto, there's these areas, these little pockets that can be preserved that have fairly decent habitat in it, but there's also going to be different impacts from the city, and this is an example. So this is dog strangling vine, and it actually grows up onto different trees and it'll actually smother them. And you can see it has something like a milkweed seed pod, and if you'd open it up you'll see that there's fluffy seed inside here, and so this can float around and spread, and birds can spread it as well. And so it's a major invasive problem. Not only are you dealing with this, you're creating a natural habitat, or you're preserving a natural habitat, and so then you have these major invasive species that can take over large areas of your habitat if there's any sort of disturbance at all. And then because it's very aggressive, it's also got a very you can see the root system on it. If you just pull it out and trying to control it, all these little bits of root will actually re-sprout, and you can see at the base there's a lot of different nodes, growth nodes all around there, and so all of those will sprout if they're left in the soil. And so it's a major issue for trying to control, because it's very difficult to remove all this dog strangling vine. But in this area you can see that there's a good diversity of different trees in here. There's conifers, there's deciduous trees, and most of the trees are native to the area. And so you have a fairly healthy ecosystem. On the soil you see there's a lot of broken branches that have fallen down. There's a lot of organic matter on the soil, so the soils are fairly rich and fairly healthy. And just looking around, you can see different age structures throughout the whole community. So there's large trees, and then you have medium trees, and then you have small trees. So you're having this constant stratification within the forest. You can't see straight through it as easily as you can in other forests. So here you can see that we have a very large old tree, and it's been cut down because it's a hazard near the trail. But inside you can see that it's been burned out. So this tree has probably been struck by lightning, but it's, in terms of forestry, you would think, oh, this is such a nice large tree and it's going to have so much wood. But really, when you look at old growth forest, a lot of the trees are hollowed out. The center is either rotted by fungus or it's had fire, like this one, and different organisms are using it for their home, and so they're hollowing it out, and really there's not a lot of wood left in there. So that in terms of cutting those old trees down, those primary forests, you're not actually getting a lot of wood, because a lot of the wood in the center has been eaten. And just looking at this tree, it's a newly fallen tree. You can see how thick the bark is on this tree. It's very thick, so if there is a fire, it's also being protected from a fire. The inside of the tree has burnt out. It's probably struck by lightning, but the outer layers were the living layers, and so that they had moisture in them and they didn't burn. And so this is an excellent habitat log. It's going to be colonized by a ton of different fungi, and you'll see going through a successional stage. One mushroom species will suddenly appear, and then another mushroom species will appear. They're changing the characteristics, and they're digesting different elements of this wood over time, and so it creates the right conditions for the next mushroom species, and then the next condition for the next species, and eventually it all degrades down into this nice humus. And here you can see a nicely rotted piece. So this is all broken down, and this is your humus and your organic matter that's going to be building your soil. And so in an older forest, a lot of times you'll see the stump, and then that creates a nice rich environment, but also the log, when it's left there, it rots down and it creates like a strip of extra nutrients in that spot, and you'll see all sorts of trees germinating and growing on that extra rich material. It's holding a lot of moisture, it's releasing a lot of nutrients because the fungus is all breaking it down, and so you get this mosaic. So you're not just creating, when you're in a new forest, you're not creating any sort of habitat heterogeneity. So you need to think about it. All this woody material that you've got here is going to degrade. It's going to create different areas that have more and less organic matter, and it's going to create different areas of richness. Some areas will be poor, and some species will use that, and some areas will be rich, and other species will need that for their habitat requirements. So just considering adding more heterogeneity into your forest is really important when you're trying to recreate a natural ecosystem, trying to find a reference ecosystem like this that's still got mother trees, the big trees, the species that have lived for a long period of time and have survived for hundreds of years through all the different, this tree survived being struck by lightning and burned out in the middle. So just having all that different genetics is extremely important to creating a new habitat, because you want that richness, the robustness of the trees that have lived for a long period of time and grown together and worked with the entire ecosystem to make something really high functioning. We want that high functioning ecosystem. We don't want a very basic monoculture. We want something that's rich, extremely rich in biodiversity. So in this area, there's a gap in the forest. So this area was cleared probably for a little bit of a pasture area, because there's a lot of pasture grasses here still. But someone's come back in and they planted trees randomly in this area. And so they're starting the process of natural regeneration. We have a healthy forest behind us in the area all around the edge. And so you're trying to mimic that sort of forest in this area and allowing that forest to come in on the edge. You can see over here on this side how the vegetation is starting to move in on the edge. So just the forest species starting to move out into this area. So you think about, okay, how can I facilitate that change back into a healthy forest? Because we're in this antsy area and all around us is good healthy forest, except for this little area that was cut out. And so you're trying to refill in this area so that you have more core area for the species that need that core area, and they need that healthy habitat. Because right now this is not a good healthy habitat. It's an old field that doesn't have a lot of biodiversity in it. So replanting some trees, facilitating the process, trying to get canopy closure as quickly as you can so that it changes the light levels in the forest, and it's over time these different trees will grow enough that they come together and they limit the amount of light, and then it will kill off the grass, because the grass needs a lot of light to survive, and that's why people are opening up the forest so that the grass can grow, because it needs a lot of light. And so we need to reverse that process, closing the canopy and changing the species composition. And once the canopy is closed, it changes the moisture levels within the forest. More moisture is being held and less is being evaporated out. And the trees are shading, so it's making the forest floor cooler, and it's making conditions so that shade tolerant species can exist, whereas this is an open, so you're going to get all sunny species. So in terms of invasive species and non-native species, this is one of the reasons that you're not choosing to use them, because you can look at these leaves and you see there's very little insect damage on them. So native species are not using it, the insects aren't keyed to it, and so they're not as valuable a habitat for native species. And you can see on this one over here as well, the same thing. You're not getting very much insect damage, so you know that these species aren't being used by our native wildlife. So you have to really consider that when you're doing your ecological restoration project. You may think this is a great nitrogen fixing plant, and that's what the reason that they put this in here is they thought, oh, it's a nitrogen fixer, it establishes rapidly and it holds the soil, so let's put in some black locust. But really it has very little nutritional value for wildlife that are native to this area, and they haven't understood, they haven't been keyed to that species that's exotic. And you can tell that this species is a legume species, because it has your typical bean pods. And here's your bean pods. You can see it's segmented, and then it has your different seeds within each different pocket, like a bean. And let's see if I can open one up very easily. But here you can see there we go. You can see the beans in there. So this is a legume, and so it'll have nitrogen fixing capabilities. And so if you're considering to use this legume species, you need to really consider not only is it a nitrogen fixer, but also is it an invasive species. This one is obviously invasive. You cut it down, it sends up suckers like crazy, and you're having to deal with even more problems because it comes up from suckers like that, and it rapidly reproduces, so it's very difficult to control once you do have it in an area. On my farm, I mistakenly planted some because the ministry was selling as a tree nursery, and this is one of the species they said, oh, here's a species to use on your restoration project. And as I was starting out, I didn't understand that, okay, this is not a native species and it's highly invasive. They didn't mention that at all. And so I made the mistake of planting it, and it took many years of digging these plants out to try to control them and stop their spread, because not only are you planting a few trees, but you give them enough time, they spread and they spread and they spread, and they take over a whole area. So you really need to consider what you're putting in before you do your restoration project, so that you're not having a big management problem later and spending a lot of time and money and effort trying to remove something that's not appropriate for the area.